everyone. For video lecture number 3, I just have a few comments to make on Richard Toy's Rhetoric, a very short introduction, which is, of course, the required reading before next class. If you haven't already done so, I'd suggest going onto Canvas and having a close look at the assignment sheet for assignment number 1, the stylistic analysis you'll do. So here you'll basically find a text of your choice and then analyze it through the concepts we've been discussing in class. So you'll be taking a text of your choice. Now that can be a written artifact or a speech that was delivered. There's quite a bit of room there for, in the world of prose, to draw some sort of text that you, for whatever reason, is interesting to you. You might find a particularly powerful and persuasive, essay or speech to you, or a piece of writing that's just simply, really beautiful. And look at the stylistic, look at it from a stylistic point of view and see what that analysis can uncover. So when you write your analysis, though, you'll see from the assignment sheet that there are really kind of 3 major moves, or 4 if you include the works cited, that you need to make. And first, before you even get to the style devices and their possible effect on the audience, before you get to that, you'll need to set the context for the text, right? And so you'll need to discuss the rhetorical situation that sort of created the prompt for this text to be uttered or written. And that's what I'd like to focus on today, is sort of recap parts of Toy's rhetoric that I think are very important, and especially those pieces that will help you work toward this first assignment. And then, of course, for the assignment, you'll go on and identify at least 4 different stylistic devices that are working in the text, offer a discussion of their likely interpretation on the audience, a kind of conclusion of what we as a group of people in English 350, what we might take away from this text you've analyzed in terms of writing, in terms of our increasing awareness of the dynamics of writing. And then last is your works cited. Okay, so have a good look at the assignment sheet. I hope you're starting to think about what text you might analyze. Bring your ideas to class next time. We'll be discussing, hopefully at the end, we'll take some time to discuss your own ideas on the text you might use. Okay, so on to a very selective review of some of the material in Toy's rhetoric. First off, we need to get our head around the idea of rhetoric itself. It's oftentimes misunderstood as a kind of seductive or unethical or empty speech, right? It's oftentimes discussed today in contrast to, say, reason or responsibility, and that's obviously not at all what we mean by that, right? If we move past popular notions of rhetoric, then we'll see kind of the heart of this discipline. And it's been around in the West at least since the time of Aristotle, who was born in 386 BC. And so it has a major role to play throughout classical antiquity, the medieval period, and then into modern and postmodern times. So we'll start with Aristotle, though, for his definition. It's the one that Toy offers most centrally, and Aristotle is thought to be the first philosopher, first intellectual to systematize this notion of persuasion. And so he sort of gets the moniker as sort of the father of rhetoric, I suppose, in the West. And so, if you want to think of it as simply as Aristotle does it, this would work fine, right? That rhetoric is simply the ability to see the available means of persuasion in any given case. Now, you want to notice here, Aristotle is not saying that it's the use of persuasion in any given case, and that's where he sort of is let off the hook in terms of the ethics involved with one's speech. He's saying that rhetoric is simply the ability to identify the available means of persuasion in each case, and whether one enlists those means of persuasion is a separate matter. But later definitions of rhetoric typically conflated those issues and said it's not really just the ability to see those means of persuasion, but it's also the use of them. And so you can kind of think of you can, I oftentimes think of rhetoric in this way, and I think this coheres with a lot of different texts on the matter. And that is, if you just step back and realize, right, that as humans, we're enveloped in symbols, and those symbols largely mediate our perception of reality, right? And those symbols can be in a variety of forms. One form is natural language, like English or French, concepts. Other forms could be imagery. Other forms could be acoustic and sonic, and on we go. And so rhetoric is really the study of those symbols that are either linguistic or iconic, meaning imagery, that we use to uh, compel others or ourselves to think, feel, or act in a different way. Okay, and so that's at its core, I think, what rhetoric is about and why it has such lasting appeal for at least 2,500 years so far. And you get a sense of that more robust definition when you look at Lloyd Bitzer's here, which is that, right, rhetoric is a mode of. Now, this Lloyd Bitzer I'm drawing from other sources, not from Toy. Okay, so I'm trying to just give you an overview of this notion of rhetoric. Toy, I think, focuses more on Burke and Aristotle, but Bitzer has a great approach, which is that rhetoric is this mode of altering reality, not through the direct application of energy to objects, meaning not in the physical world, right? You can alter reality in many ways. Materially, you can, by changing the physical world in some way. Bitzer's saying that that's, of course, not what rhetoric is about. It's about altering reality by the creation of discourse, which changes reality by changing the way we think about reality, right? Through the mediation of thought and action. And so, in this sense, rhetoric is always persuasive. Burke's example, or Burke's definition, is very similar to the notion I mentioned before, which is that we are symbol wielding animals, to quote Burke from another source, and we are moved and react to symbols collectively and individually. And rhetoric is the study as well as the act of that motion or movement or response to symbols. Okay, my old advisor had a more practical view. My old PhD advisor, Charles Bazerman at UC Santa Barbara, he would offer this, that rhetoric is simply the study of how people use language and other symbols. By other symbols, he might be thinking images or mathematics, to realize human goals and to carry out human activities. That it's ultimately a practical study offering people great control over their symbolic activity. And that practical nature is what I hope that we're bringing to this class, that we're all trying to gain more conscious control over our own symbol use, and rhetoric offers a tool for doing so. So that's kind of a quick dive into what is rhetoric as a field, and now we'll just move into some of the high points that you can't miss when you read Toy. You really need to, if you've already read Toy, please go back and consider the sections I'm discussing now. And if you haven't read Toy, this is a good place to start with this PowerPoint. But of course, you're responsible for fully reading, the full breadth of Toy's book, not just this PowerPoint. So within the world of classical rhetoric, which is essentially the rhetoric that was developed by the Greeks around the 4th century BC, chiefly by Aristotle, but by other players as well, there is something called rhetorical genres. So Aristotle, in his book on rhetoric, realizes that logical argument isn't enough in his mind to explain human behavior in Attic Grecian times. Okay, so in Athens, in classical antiquity. And he says, we're doing more than just finding truths in our lives. We use symbols for more than finding truths. And so he outlines 3 different areas where we're typically using symbols in more civic purposes, right? And the first is the forensic, and the forensic simply means the legal contexts. And so he would say, if you're deploying symbols, for Aristotle it would have been more oral traditions, right, oration. But today we discuss it in terms of literate traditions too, reading and writing, right? So if you're deploying symbols and working toward some sort of effect on an audience that is concerned with justice and injustice, and the purpose is to, to accuse or defend a set of people or an idea. We're typically talking about legal contexts here, and we're typically talking about the past, right? Events have occurred, and we are trying to interpret them in forensic matters, right? In terms of justice and injustice, and so that would be a case of legal forensic rhetorics. Now, that's not only set in legal places, right? This is not only for the courtroom. For instance, if you have a speaker such as Martin Luther King discussing issues of justice and injustice from a pulpit, accusing or defending, set on past events, you could call that a forensic genre, forensic discourse, even though it's far removed from the courtroom. Okay. Second, Aristotle noticed that outside of the courts, we oftentimes use rhetoric in ceremonies, right? We deploy symbols in ceremonies. The most classic case here would probably be the funeral eulogy. And in that case, he would call that genre the epideictic rhetorical genre. And here, we're concerned with praising or blaming a particular person or idea, focused on one's virtues and one's failures or misgivings, namely their vices, and that's typically set in the present in terms of what are we to gain, what are we to learn from this person's example. Would be in the case of a funeral oration. And so if you find yourself reading a text and you're like, oh, it's really discussing values. It's discussing certain values and encouraging a society or an audience to live by certain virtues. And in doing so, it's praising or blaming particular characters. You might make the case that speech or text is epideictic in part, in nature. Again, even if it's not a formal ceremony of some sort. And then last, we can't leave out, of course, political contexts. And Aristotle and others are clear that there's a deliberative genre. And that's, as you can see here, in the matter of politics, right? We're not really looking at the past or the present, but we're discussing the good and the unworthy in terms of the future. How ought we behave? How ought we operate in the future? And oftentimes here, the purpose is in some way to exhort or to dissuade, right? And so you have an encouragement of certain ideas that are good and worthy of our attention, or dissuading us from unworthy ideas. And so you might find cases, of course, in the political realm and beyond that meet this genre. And so what I'm asking, you'll see in the assignment, is for you to think about the text that you're using, you're analyzing, in terms of these three genres. To what degree is this text's setting and purpose forensic, epideictic, and or deliberative? And it can be all three. And so that's part of the assignment number one, and part of just understanding the basic foundation of classical rhetoric. Okay. Next would be the rhetorical appeals. And so here, if you remember how I mentioned that in his mind, human behavior really isn't fully accounted for through the notion of just logic, a kind of philosophical approach to logically working through an argument. And he saw in Athens, of course, cases where human behavior was accounted for through extra logical or extra argumentative appeals. And so he offers three appeals in any argument. And the first is logos, and that is, the argument itself, the logical substance of whatever act or utterance is happening. And so if you're giving a speech, I would hope there's some sort of content that likely appeals to the rational faculties in an audience. And Aristotle argues, though, that that's really not enough to persuade an audience, or at least descriptively, as he based on his observation, it hasn't been all that's been comprised of in a speech, right? He says more things are going on. Number two would be, not only are you providing a certain logical argument for your audience, but you're oftentimes, as speakers or writers, disposing your audience, or attempting to dispose your audience to a certain set of emotions, so that they're more likely to entertain the logos, the argument itself. So if you're attempting to give a public speech to persuade a Senate to go to war against a foreign country, yes, you hopefully have a logical argument, but you probably also want to rouse certain emotions in that audience, like a sense of threat or indignation, right? You want to create a circumstance where they're feeling a kind of set of emotions that will essentially persuade them to take your argument, that where your argument will be more effective. And then third is just ethos, which sometimes Toy calls character. That's debatable, I guess. What do you mean by character? Aristotle at times is clear when he discusses that it's not your reputation, it's that kind of perceived credibility or character in the moment of the speaker or writer. And so Aristotle is arguing here, right, that a strong orator or writer for us would not only have a solid argument, but would attempt to activate certain emotions in the audience that would increase the likelihood that they would consider the argument. And then third, the right person needs to be giving the speech or writing the piece. And so you show your competence in writing. When you show your competence as a writer, as a thinker, as a just person, you're making an appeal to your ethos. And so those are the rhetorical appeals. You might find those useful as you think through your analysis this semester. Okay, and then last, I just have a few miscellaneous terms. The first one, I don't believe Toy doesn't address in his book. I could be wrong, but I didn't see it as I reread the text. The first is exigence. An exigence is simply that thing in society that prompts someone to respond, and when that in a symbolic way, right? So if society pokes you in a certain way and you respond by speaking, writing, or in some other way offering a symbolic response, perhaps through gesture, that initial provocation or poke was the exigence. And I'll be asking you that of the piece you picked, right? So you pick a piece that you're going to study, a speech, a text, and you'll have to answer that question in the assignment, which is, what provoked that piece to be brought into creation in the first place? And that oftentimes helps us set the context of the piece, right? If you understand the exigence, then you understand what the piece is responding to. Kairos is another term that's pretty useful, and Toy, I think, well defines it as simply an opportune moment. And I'll say so there's a kind of, right, there, occasions arise in our lives. And there are moments when certain utterances or written texts are more likely to be effective than other moments. And so it would be good for us as writers, thinkers, speakers to be aware of the moment-to-moment change in the opportunity for certain kinds of utterances to have an effect, right? You have to realize the occasion. And so what you wouldn't want to think of here is, the Greeks have a great way of separating these two issues. Kairos is that moment-to-moment change, that kind of socially constructed reality of an opportunity for an utterance to be really have effectiveness, as opposed to chronos, which is simply the march of time, a kind of physical march of time, right? And so kairos sometimes is confused with chronos. And I want to clarify that here. That's why I mentioned compare, really contrast to chronos. Okay, so chronos would just be a simple, physical movement of time, in terms of story structure or in terms of just literal, time. And kairos is a much more subjective understanding of the different valencies or the different opportunities available within each segment of chronos. Okay. Third would be enthymeme. Enthymemes are simply unstated beliefs or statements that a writer or speaker assumes that an audience possesses. And that's important for anyone writing or communicating where you want to transact some sort of meaning, right? Every speech, every written text has a set of assumptions built in. And when we start thinking about those assumptions, and which ones the audience would need to subscribe to for that speech or text to be persuasive, now we're engaging in enthymematic analysis or enthymemes. And so you might want to think about that. It's an important element within classical rhetoric that Toy does address. Last, I'll just point out his discussion of Kenneth Burke's terministic screens. This is another way to sort of return to the earlier slide that dealt with rhetoric as the study of the way in which symbols mediate our understanding of reality. And so terministic screens are, as Toy suggests, cognitive or emotional filters created by symbols. In other words, they're concepts, beliefs, assumptions that we live by, and that they affect how we interpret our reality. Okay, so you might have a certain concept in mind. For instance, if you think about, say, the divine, let's say you have some belief in a higher power of sorts. A terministic screen would be the kind of assumptions or imagery you bring to mind when you think about a higher power and how that might shape how you interact with that higher power or how you interact in the world. And so folks who place a higher power, say, in the sky out of a kind of Hellenistic tradition, right? And personify a higher power into to a gendered bodied being of some sort, right? That sort of concept tends to mediate how we interact with such a higher power. And other folks who have a wildly different image of a higher power behave differently, of course. And still others who refuse to accept any imagery or concept of a higher power would act still differently. So that would be one example. And I think it's important to read what Toy has to say here about terministic screens. Of course, all of this is up for further discussion next week. So please take the quiz, read Toy, and bring your questions to class, and we'll continue. Thanks, everybody.